Let's now talk about what a proportion is and how to see if two ratios make up a proportion. So I'm going to show you one method to see whether or not two ratios make up a proportion. And in a later video, I'm going to show you something called the cross product or cross multiplication, which is a great method for doing just what I said before, showing whether or not two ratios make a proportion. So let's check this out. This says a proportion is an equation with two equal ratios. And I've given you an example up here, one of a proportion and one of something that is not a proportion. Here we have two ratios, 1/2 and 3/6. 1 to 2 is the same as 3 to 6, or 1/2 is equal to 3/6. So this is considered a proportion, or you could say 1/2 is proportional to 3/6. 5/7 does not equal to 9/14. We can see that by getting this to be out of 14, we would have to multiply it by 2. So we multiply that by 2 and we'd get 10 over 14, which is not 9 over 14. So this is said to not make a proportion, or 5/7 is not proportional to 9/14. I want to go a little more in depth into showing how we know if two ratios make a proportion or not. I just kind of skimmed over it here to give you the definition of a proportion. Now into the nitty-gritty of showing if two ratios make a proportion. So this says, do the following ratios make a proportion? So let's look at this first pair, 5/8 and 13/24. To show, or at least one method to show whether or not these make a proportion is simply make the fractions into having equivalent denominators. So if that's a very easy method to do, meaning I look at 8 and 24 and say, I can easily make them into the same denominator, we can see if the fractions are equivalent fractions. If they are, then we have a proportion. If they're not, then we don't have a proportion. So I look at 5/8 and I think, well, if I multiply that by 3, I'll get 24ths. So I'm multiplying the denominator by 3 and numerator by 3 simply because that will line us up with the same denominator. 3 times 5 is 15. So I have 15/24, and if we compare that to the 13/24 that we had, we clearly see that 15/24 is not equal to 13/24. So no, 5/8 and 13/24 do not make a proportion, or 5/8 is not proportional to 13/24. Very cool. So again, just looking to see, are the fractions equivalent? Or are the ratios equivalent? Another way of saying that. Let's look at 7/5 and 35/25. Now there's another way that we could see if they're equivalent fractions. You might notice that this guy right here has the same, well, a denominator that is 5 times that. So instead of multiplying this by 5 to get 25, we could reduce the numerator and denominator of this fraction by 5. And I can do that because I see that the numerator also has a common factor of 5. So I'm going to divide both the numerator and denominator by 5. So we're dividing by 5 over 5. That gives us 7 over 5, or 7/5. And we see that 7/5 is equal to itself. So 7/5 is equal to 35/25. And so we have a proportion, two ratios that are equal. We could have also multiplied 7 and 5 by 5, both on the numerator and denominator, to get 35/25. Either way you go about it, we were able to show that we have equivalent ratios, and so we've got a proportion.